I just have to read this introduction because I don't know how to do anything without a script. I want to extend my thanks first to Victoria Miro for not only supporting this occasion in the best possible practical way, but allowing it to happen. I don't know many responsible people in the world who would allow artists to have the run of a place, but it seems to me that Mrs. Miro and Warren, her partner in all things, and their true and pleasant staff probably see more in other people than they see in themselves. I don't think it would be remiss to mention here, too, the warm support of the artists Peter Doig and Georgie Hopton and Gary Hume, who, in the first case, support painters like Celia Paul with an avidity that's uncommon in a fairly avaricious world, and in the second case, have literally made a home for writers and performers who are uncertain, as most artists and performers are. Completing the circle is a figure who looms large on this occasion, the poet Angus Cook. 10 years ago, the last time I was in London, Angus kept trying to put me together with a painter friend of his named Celia Paul. I never met Celia on that trip. There was another long pause in our almost association, and then in 2011, she was good enough to lend Peter and I a painting we included in our exhibition, Self-Consciousness. And there was another pause until the Sunday before last, when Celia and I met for the first time. And in any case, Angus and Peter made us friends before we even knew we were missing the friendship. Ladies and gentlemen, Celia Paul. I just wanted to have the audience pause for a minute to look around at the room and the work here. And one of the things that struck me about it almost immediately was that all of the pieces were about nature, that there was no difference between the face being like the sea and the sea being like a face and the British Museum being like a mountain. And it feels so much like an emotional retrospective, a looking forward and a looking back, because the first things that you painted, you said once, were from nature.
Yes.
So, can you describe that a little bit to me?
Well, I feel you've said something quite true there, because in some ways, like this little painting of the room behind you is as much a self-portrait as the row of self-portraits there. And my first paintings before I came to the Slade were of bits of nature that I found. And then the transition to painting my mother didn't seem such a leap.
Right.
So,
It's all one body. And I'm wondering, when you started painting, give us a time frame for that. Your family you were born where?
I was born in India and came back to England when I was 5. And when I was 11, my father became head of this religious community in Devon, and I was then sent to boarding school. And it was the combination of being both at a religious community, living there, and going to boarding school, meant that I didn't really have any privacy, and so painting became a way of kind of controlling my inner world. And it wasn't really to do with art in that kind of way, it was just really to do with controlling my world. And there was this amazing art teacher who wrote to Lawrence Gowing at the Slade, and I was 16 and then came up to London then.
The religious community that you just sketched, that your father was head of, let's go back a little bit and talk about the transition from India to England. What do you remember about that sort of transition? There's a lovely description in Catherine's essay in one of your catalogs describing how your mother had a certain degree of freedom in India and also physical attention to clothing and jewelry and so on.
That's right. It was incredibly beautiful. It was in Trivandrum, and my mother used to wear these very, very beautiful clothes, sometimes saris, but more often kind of English clothes, kind of swirling out at the waist. Beautiful. I remember particularly a kind of cream satin with red roses, and she seemed an incredibly glamorous figure to me. And my father was head of this theological seminary, and so there were lots of very kind of gorgeous Indian students around, so who my mother would flirt with. And I think I felt a bit threatened by that.
Mm-hmm.
And my 3 older sisters, I've got 4 sisters, and I'm the 4th, so there's one younger than me. But my 3 older ones were sent to boarding school in the hills in India when they were 4. So my oldest sister was put on a plane by herself when she was 4.
This is such a, just to be a crude American, but it's such a strange idea of sending. I don't understand the system at all. What is the idea of sending a child away? I really don't understand it.
I don't know, it was something to do with education, I think. But
or trauma, right?
you have to
Yes.
get over it.
Get on with it.
But I escaped that because, I got ill, so we came back to England to get treatment. So, and then I was fine actually. So.
Do you think you were anticipating being sent away?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there was this shadow hanging over me, and I was so kind of in love with my mother, and the kind of trauma of having a younger sister and everything. I remember that very clearly. But I do also remember the incredible beauty. There was this garden, and there was something called a changing rose, which starts off white in the morning, and then by the evening it's kind of blood red. I think it's a kind of hibiscus.
Mm-hmm.
But, and the calls of the birds, and amazingly beautiful.
Every artist works, I think, from reality that they transform almost immediately into something else, and then memory becomes something else. And so you went back to the family home, but it's very funny. So you have to describe. You were going to stay for how long, and to paint it.
Yes, it was because I'd left when I was 5, and when I was 45, I went back to specifically paint the house where I was born, and I booked my ticket to go for 3 weeks and to fly to Trivandrum. But when I got there, I was so desperately homesick that I spent most of the time trying, in a rickshaw, going from one travel agent to another to try and book my ticket home. So in fact, I stayed only 4 days. But I did do these sketches in the garden of the house, and then when I came back to my studio in London, I painted it. And
do you think it would have been? Do you think? I think it would have been not even as powerful if you had not had the break from it, and then tried to imagine it from sketches, because it's so filled with feeling.
Yeah, it was extraordinary because I'd remembered it so clearly, and obviously it was that usual thing of everything being smaller than you'd remembered. But I was invited in to the house and given breakfast in the room, and I'd remembered how each room led into the other, and in fact my father had designed the house. It was a very, very basic little house with red tiled roof, whitewashed. But I remembered the veranda where you could look out onto the paddy fields, and I felt again that feeling of how strange it was to be part of this kind of very English family of 5 girls, and we were always being photographed, and that sense of being somehow different and displaced came back to me very strongly. But also the kind of magic of the way the garden circled round, and that the way the light, the sun comes up at exactly 6 every morning and goes down at 6.
Yes.
And so I arrived to do my sketches just before 6 in the morning, and then suddenly this whole flood lit with shadows from the trees as the sun burst up, and it was an incredible feeling of, and I felt very strongly the presence of my father, who actually died in 1983, but I felt the presence of him there, and it was almost like we were, it was haunted by the feeling of him and us little girls playing in the garden as well. So it was full of memory, yeah.
Do you remember, Georgie sent me to this great bookstore called Persephone, and I was telling you that I was reading the descriptions of all the novels, and there were so many novels, English novels about children who were on their own, or they had taken a journey and ended up without parents or elders. And your father's presence has sort of darted in and out of your history as an artist in other things I've read. And I think it'd be wonderful to talk about him a little bit today, because the anniversary of losing him is coming up.
That's right.
And it would be, I think he's here now, so.
Yeah, no, actually, yes. I mean, you and I are going to visit my mother in Cambridge on July the 10th.
Yes.
Which is Thursday. And my father died on July the 10th, 1983, from a brain tumour, which was only diagnosed very late, so he died very soon after it had been diagnosed.
What was his faith, Celia? Because it's unclear to me when I read what he was a theologian. He had gone to Cambridge, and he met your mother in London.
That's right. Yes, he was doing further degree and teaching in London after Cambridge. He'd been in the war, so he'd left Cambridge for a bit and then went back to finish his degree. And I think he'd got into Cambridge to do languages, but I think the experience of being in the war had kind of changed him, so he went back and did theology. But I know he was, I know when he first married my mother, she went out to join him in India. He'd already been out there for a year and they hadn't seen each other, and when they met, he apologized to her and said he didn't think he could love anyone because the experience of the war. So, which was a pretty sort of traumatic thing for my mother, who's always been such a sort of emotional, soft-hearted, spoiled only child, that
Yes.
To have this was a big shock to her, I think.
How did they adjust to his psychological reality?
I think
she probably got more beautiful and more attention.
she did.
Yes.
She got a lot of attention. She adores attention. She kind of opens up like a flower. She can't, she's can't get enough.
Yes.
It's and I think you'll see that when you meet her.
Yes.
I'm sorry there aren't any paintings of her here. I stopped working from her in 2007 because my studio is up 80 stairs, and she couldn't climb them. She's yes, as I say, she's 87 now, and I've tried to work from her in her very tiny house in Cambridge, but it's not really to do with the space. It's just it's her space, not mine. So.
Right. What was the while they were producing this extraordinary sort of tribe? What did you feel about their relationship, or were you always more immediately close to your mother, and was your father more removed as a person?
I think he was. I think he probably had a very, I don't know, we were very much daughters and mother, and him slightly on the outside of things, which must have been very difficult for him. But then in his last 2 years, because I left the Slade in 1981, and they were living in Bradford, and so I lived with them from 81 to 83 when he died, and I'd just come down to London to see Lucian and then come back up again, and I became very, very close to my father then.
It's very interesting, and it's always an opportunity to have them go back and understand the ways in which they were success as a parent, and because all of your sisters are so high achieving, there's no accident that there was some sort of support that you all felt to be able to do that. Can you tell me a little bit about his? I read also, Catherine quotes you as saying that initially you would you would paint your mother with her blouse open, or your father's reaction was pretty strong.
Yeah, no, it was interesting because I did. When I first went to the Slade, I kind of realised I couldn't work from the model because she didn't mean anything to me. So the person who meant most was my mother. So I started working from her, and somehow I got intrigued by working from life models, and because I felt so passionately about my mother, I asked her to sit for me naked, and my father was fine about that somehow, but I did this painting of her with her blouse open and her tits hanging out, and he wasn't so. He kind of he said, you know, how could you do this? You know, how could you bring yourself to do this? And it had never occurred to either my mother or me that there was anything kind of pervy in it at all. So,
plus, she has a really great sense of humor too.
Yeah, she does. Yes, yes, and she's, you know, she always says yes to. I mean, obviously, if it was wrong, but just she's so generous.
It's a way of saying yes to life, right?
Yeah.
Tell me this. So you were. You got off the hook, so you were sent away at 11, so you had 7 more years of family life. And so you were doing these paintings, and the instructor sent some things to the head of the Slade?
That's right.
How old were you?
I was 16, and I took my portfolio up to the Slade to show to Lawrence Gowing, and
tell us a little bit about him.
oh well, Catherine will know as much as me, but he was a really, really great, extraordinary man, huge, with this incredible speech impediment, which somehow everything was very dramatic. He gave these wonderful art lectures at the Slade, and his Caravaggio lecture went down in history because he got so excited. He was this huge, out-of-control man who would gesture and always knock things flying. And he made this sort of wide gesture about Caravaggio and fell off the stage. But he was also a really great man, and if anyone hasn't read his book on Vermeer, they should, because it's one of the great pieces of art writing. He was an extraordinary, beautiful writer, and with this deep insight, and a very profoundly emotional man as well.
Were you working in oils then?
Yes, I was, yes. I had already started to work in oils. Yes, it was then he invited Lucian to come and be a visiting tutor. But I was 18 when I'd been at Slade for 2 years before I met Lucian. And I showed him these drawings of my mother. I did kind of, I loved her legs, and I just, did all these kind of charcoal studies of the backs of her knees, and I think Lucian really felt a connection to me through these works of my mother, because I think he'd done this extraordinary series of paintings of his own mother, and which I'd just seen at the Anthony Doffey Gallery.
When I was telling you about that wonderful quote of Dan Arbus's, we were talking earlier, and I said that when she described her shock and amazement always that people were willing to sit for her. And then she realized that it was an extraordinary amount of attention to pay to another human being, that it was honoring them in some way. Your relationship with Lucian was what it was personally, but as an artist, did you feel that attention was something that validated you as an artist, or was it something that just fed what was already there?
Well, I didn't actually start sitting for Lucian until 2 years into our relationship. He did the first painting of me in 1980. So for the first 2 years, I kind of did feel completely energized by his presence and talent and his intensity. And my work, I think, became much more ambitious because of that. But when he started painting me, I did find that really difficult. I'm not, I prefer to be the one who's paying attention rather than having attention given to me. And so I think it was quite a subtle thing, though, because I became aware of how giving you can be as a sitter, and how by, very subtly you can show the artist if you're feeling resentful of sitting. You can, by not actually, you can be very passive aggressive about it.
Yes.
And
your sister Kate wrote something very beautiful about the experience of sitting for you, and she said that, like your father, your father wanted to get back to writing his sermon, so it would be 10 minutes, and then he would be gone in his head somewhere. She said she was similar, and that the paintings that you made of them at that time, it's in the 90s, I guess, late 80s.
it was, that was the late 70s.
Late 70s.
Yeah,
She said that there was a coldness that she loved about them, whereas your mother rushed to the canvas.
Yes, yes, she opened out and just adored the attention. So I think Kate said she was like a living presence in a still life, didn't
Yes,
she?
yes.
And so Kate, she was kind of pointing out how much you give through sitting. I mean, if you're just sitting reading a book and not giving yourself utterly to the painter, it's quite a different thing.
So was Lucian, as you were modeling, was he frustrated by your ambivalence about being seen in that way?
I'm not sure. He works in such a different way to me that he kind of spurred himself on a lot by getting very angry. He was very, he would be kind of hitting himself with his knife or something, or brush all the time on his thigh to kind of goad himself on, and be full of this kind of anger with himself, which often felt like it was angry with me, but I think he was like that with everyone. And it didn't seem to make much difference, really, as far as I could tell, whether I was giving myself to it or not. He seemed very very
it was
much
his own head.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And when you have someone, let's say, aside from your mother, this beautiful painting of Steve. One of the extraordinary things about that painting is that he's looking at you. And often there's the vision of the subject is looking down or away. When someone like Steve pays attention to you, how does it affect your process?
It's a very different thing. It's a far less peaceful thing. As I'm very aware that, although I think Steve is always slightly aware of what I'm doing and of my presence in the room, whereas Kate is in her own world, and it's a more peaceful feeling. Whereas to engage in that way has the airwaves between us are more turbulent. And when you sat for me that very briefly, there was a tension, wasn't there? Because you sat down and...
Because I did the weirdest thing, but really not very unusual, but for me anyway. I just looked at her. And so the question was, for me, was, is this enough for you?
I know, it was so moving and beautiful. And I felt so that you hadn't really changed since you were a baby, actually.
I'm always trying to impersonate an adult, and then it just doesn't work.
But
I apologize. Yeah.
It was something so kind of open about the way you sat down and looked at me, which was, and I saw very much your vulnerability in that way.
Oh, thank you. May I quote your son?
Yes.
Okay. Frank Paul is a really good writer, and he wrote about the experience of sitting for his mother, and it's just so good. And it's of a piece with what we're talking about now, and it's a piece that he wrote in 2005 called Sitting for My Mom, and he recalls that as a child he would, quote, lay in the grass between my desire to impress my mom by lying as still as I could and my desire to rebel against the unfairness of the belief that a young boy should be made to sit motionless for what seemed like hours on end just because he had suffered the unfortunate fate of being the son of a painter. He's also a really great graphic novelist, so his language is very graphic and good. He then goes on to say that after the sitting, after the sitting with him and your mother, whom you call Polly, you would shut yourself off in the shed and cry. And he says that your mother would reassure you and say that you were a great painter and it was the greatest painting ever, and then you would remind her how much she didn't like it. So then, I don't think anyone can ever win in situations like that, but the intimacy that Frank describes in the piece, the tension between wanting to be there and not wanting to be there, I think is something that all subjects undergo, and every artist feels the disappointment between the dream of the painting or the story or the novel and the reality. The minute you describe a tree, you've reduced it. It doesn't say everything that you want to say. What is it about paint itself that expresses something about the subterranean confusion that I just described? Downstairs there are watercolors, and upstairs there are oils, and there's a difference because of texture and the possibility of what's possible with those medium. Tell me what feels sort of deeper or more natural to you as a element in terms of that subterranean confusion.
I think in both cases, my arm connects with my insides in a way that's so very different to, say, writing. I mean, it's more like a kind of the actual physical thing of my arm connects with pain, and it's something that's very, very cerebral or cerebral, however you pronounce it. And I think with the watercolours, because paper itself is such a beautiful substance that I kind of use it within the image in a very different way. And when I paint, I very often have the paper mounted on canvas to kind of give it a substance. And then when I paint, I kind of let the watercolour just drip vertically because it kind of enhances and justifies the beauty of the surface of the paper, so that the image kind of grows out of it, almost like I'm carving into the paper. And if I leave kind of bits of, say, the material that my sisters are wearing blank, unpainted, they have a kind of effect like a highlight. They have a kind of translucence in themselves, so that the paper and the paint are interwoven in this quite mysterious way. Whereas with oil paints, you kind of build it's like more like a stage set. You build the image into the surface, and the space becomes something very different.
Tangible in a different way than paper?
Yeah, tangible in a different way, and always very aware of the actual texture of the canvas, so that almost paint can be used like kind of the equivalent of musical notes on bars.
Yes.
Very aware of the vertical and horizontal in the canvas.
When you have the painting, and you can find it online, is of your sisters and you in the background observing them. One of the things that profoundly affects me about your work is, even though you're not religious, I don't think anyone can paint the human form and not feel that it should be elevated in some way in their mind. I don't think particularly painters denigrate. They believe too much in the human form to denigrate it or degrade it. And one of the things that I find beautiful about your pictures of your sisters, it's a reality and not a criticism of their femaleness and their groupness. There are religious women in your family. I don't really see that much different between their faith and your faith.
No, and I think somehow the act of painting could be seen like a kind of prayer in a way, that you're kind of launching into the unknown and kind of really asking for help. It's a crisis. You need help.
Yes.
And you have to get it. I don't know. So in that way, I feel there isn't that much difference.
When you look at your sisters in your paintings, as I say, it's a group and it's femaleness and it's family. Your story is very different than your sister's, and each sister has a different story. Have you, in those works, looked at each sister individually or looked at them as a collective, and you as, like Brenda, not an I or me, or conversely, as the group yourself?
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, we certainly work collectively. They had to kind of sit together to get the kind of...
And do they complain to each other about you or to each other about themselves? I'm just continuing the Brenda theme.
I don't know, it's kind of...
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
I don't know, it's when we're together, there's, I don't know, it's so difficult to tell because we have kind of this language that is difficult to convey. I'm very, very close to Kate, and we speak all the time, and we've all been kind of given a kind of role, maybe by my mother, who quite likes, she's quite naughty by playing us off against each other. But I do sometimes quite like to sneak myself in to try and pretend that I am just, you know, a sitter. So I, like in this self-portrait, I kind of sitting,
With
you know,
one,
with
because
my,
they often wear, yes.
and with my hands in my lap and looking down. But I think it's always kind of slightly obvious that I'm the wolf in sheep's clothing in that way. But I mean, it is obviously a different thing to look in on them, and I think they all, unlike me, as far as I know, I think they like to be looked at. So I think they all quite enjoy that experience of sitting for me.
Tell me about the experience of going back to this idea of nature and the face being anything. And here you have the sea and the British Museum. You've lived across the street from the museum. How long now?
I've lived there since 1982.
Yes.
So.
Tell me, what does that form mean to you, or this action of waves mean? It feels the same to me, but maybe there's a differentiation.
Well, the waves, I kind of, I wanted them to be kind of portraits of waves. I went back to the religious community in Devon to paint the waves. So it felt like they were my waves. So I sat on the beach and I kind of noticed how each wave would have its own portrait. It would be its own self, but part of this continuous flow. So in a way it was quite like the line of my sisters all kind of wearing their watery dresses, and so in that way they are very connected. The British Museum, I kind of, it's got this very kind of simplistic structure, almost like a child's house. So in a way it kind of relates to me back to my first experience of the house where I was born, which was a very childlike kind of building. And for me it kind of symbolizes my mother. It's got this kind of, you know, welcomes people in. But to the left, as I look at it, I look directly onto the forecourt, and to the left, behind the British Museum, is this very lonely, remote post office tower. And you can guess what that... No, but it's...
I might need help with that, yeah. Are we crazy? Yeah.
So,
there was something that I read that I loved. You were asking about friends of mine and what they did when they painted. You said, oh, X person I know listens to music, and one of the things that you do is you're a very great reader, but you can only read certain things at certain times. Is your reading dictated by the sitter and the atmosphere of the sitter, or what you're trying to achieve as a painter?
Well, I know when I was, I did this, when I was doing that watercolour of my sisters, I was also doing these big paintings of the British Museum. And I thought it was quite important to reread Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy, because the way Hardy kind of sets the scene by landscape.
Yes.
And in the beginning of Return of the Native, there's this amazing description of Egdon Heath, the kind of grandeur and vastness of it, before kind of closing into the very intimate detail of the lives of his characters.
Mhm.
And so I kind of wanted my sisters to be this kind of intimate narrative set against the backdrop of this very grand, kind of monumental facade of the museum.
And feeling. Yes.
Yes.
Would you like to play a game with me?
Mm-hmm.
It's a kind of visual desert island discs, so I'm just gonna, but we don't have to limit it to, but we'll talk about some favorite painters and what they might mean to you. The wonderful thing about, for me anyway, being in London is that you can say something and almost anyone who lives in the city knows what you're talking about. So in the taxi here, the driver said, "Oh, Walter Sickert lived on that street." And I said, "Oh, I love his paintings." And he says, "Well, Jack the Ripper, blah, ha, ha, ha." And let's talk about Walter Sickert.
Yeah, no, he's certainly a favourite of mine, and I feel a kind of connection to him. And we were speaking about this the other day, and that this letter he wrote to Virginia Woolf, where he wanted her to write about him, because he said something really funny. He said that people will always be bored stiff by the technique of painting, the kind of the paint box twaddle, I think he said. And but he said what they really love is the humour and drama
And the story.
and the story.
Yes.
And so he said something like, "Thank goodness, I'm a literary painter, thank goodness."
Yes.
And he said to her, "You be the first to say so." And then she wrote this amazing
It was beautiful.
piece about him.
It was the weirdest thing
Yeah, well,
because
I know.
it made me feel like a plagiarist, basically. So don't read her. Just buy the catalog over there. Frank Auerbach?
Yes, no, well, he's a great artist for me, very, very important. He's, again, this kind of humane eloquence and the kind of the struggle of the marks kind of making the beauty of, the trying to pin something down becomes this incredibly emotive act.
But, so one artist I wanted to ask you about was Gwen John, and you had a show with some of her paintings, and for those of us who don't know about Gwen, can you talk a little bit about her work and life?
Well, I kind of feel a kind of connection. She was also a Slade student, and she had a long affair with Rodin and was his model as well. And she became a very, very private person, and the thing that meant most to her was to get more of an inner vision, and her work is incredibly still. The stillness kind of is the quality that defines it. And you can see the time kind of written in, the time taken to paint the image is written into the image in this incredibly peaceful way.
It's funny, one of the things that strikes me and makes me know that I'm looking at something that I want to pay attention to is the artist's ability to be alone. There's lots of people who make things, and I'm not talking about sitters or studios or anything like that, but the variability for the artist to live in the isolation of his or her imagination. And I think that that's what I see so much in your work, is your ability to actually be alone in it. And so that's a gift. That comes at a very high price, of course, isolation and a certain loneliness, but it's also the thing that makes the narrative of the work. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I think some people might have some questions. So please feel, there's a microphone going around, and there's a young lady right here.
Thank you. It's lovely to hear you both talk, and it's a very fascinating form of conversation, and there's so many things that have come up because of it, but there's just the one thing I wanted to ask you, Celia, at the moment, which is that in my experience of sitting for you, I was really struck by the way you paint, physically by the way you paint. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but I don't think people would necessarily know how you stand. Can you say something about that?
Well, it's difficult to describe without actually doing a mime act. But, I work in silence, and I think you did a little film, didn't you? But I'm not really that aware of what I'm doing, but it's very. I have my palette on the table beside me, so I'm kind of standing, looking, say, at you, and so I'm not really. My focus is on you rather than the paint, and so I can't really tell what I've done until after you've left, and then when you've gone out of the studio, I can then push the easel back and stand back and see what I've done. But the painting is a kind of response to what I'm seeing.
So maybe I can just add that the shock of sitting for you was to realise that you stand in a very definite way, which I think is habitual now, and it's balanced, with one foot forward and one foot back. And you paint with your arms stretched out, is that right? And your eyes partly closed. So it's the most intensely particular way of painting, and I think you said to me it's something to do with feeling. Mm-hmm. Is that right? I hope you don't mind my describing.
I don't know what I look like, but I know it's sort of, it is.
You get yourself ready to perform. But may I just ask you, do you paint the watercolours differently, or do you always... Okay, Matisse painted with his arms stretched out too. Is there anything relevant there?
Well, Matisse, I know, did it to probably for a similar reason, although he was obviously much more successful, but just to do with the calmness, a kind of, so that nothing can impede between your arm and here.
This is another question about how you approach when you begin to paint, because I've also sat for you, and you have to have quietness before, and that's very important for you, and you can't really have somebody staying with you the night before or anything like that. And also, actually, what you were saying about reading, you can't read anything that's going to perturb you or distress you, or you can't go out to parties before. And I was wondering, is that because it gets in the way of what you paint, or when you paint, it produces something other than what you would want? If you, say, did go out to a party before, would you find yourself painting an angrier painting or a more distressed painting?
Well, it's just to do with that the best things come if you concentrate, and so...
and are open.
Yeah. And so
unencumbered by
that's right.
fatigue or...
And what people, buzzing through your head, conversations and things, so...
This one thing which troubles me a bit is that your paintings are very sensual, very sensuous, but why are they presented behind glass? Because they're all paintings, so in a way they don't need glass to protect them.
Oh, I love glass. I love the kind of depth it gives to, particularly to dark areas, paint. I think it has a transforming quality. I think it's part of the whole image.
Do you know to just catch that?